Anyone?
Hi, I wouldn't mind reading. This is Ambika.
Go ahead, start reading.
The condition of the working class.
One sec, before you start. So, just as a kind of a orientation for the for these readings. So this bunch of readings is mainly about, as the title suggests, city, class, and power. It looks at the question of economic classes, um, and its links with urbanization or certain forms of urbanization. All right. So obviously, this the set of readings begins with Frederick Engels's Conditions of Working Classes in England, which is probably the most popular early text on class and urbanization. And then there are two other essays, but one by Manuel Castells. And what is important to look out for in these readings is the, uh, the I mean, we've discussed class in the last year, but the question at that time was mainly about trying to understand the formation of classes, or formation of classes, the working class and the capitalist class and so on, from the perspective of political economy. Right now, what we are doing here is really looking at the spatial manifestations of class. For instance, questions of the conditions of living, especially, particularly of the working class, questions of the relationship between income and living conditions, or questions of segregation, or questions of gentrification. So not just questions of working class conditions, but also also we look at how, for instance, urban spaces are transformed in mainly catering to a certain classes. So I think the second essay that we'll be looking at will be focused on certain markers of class that are created in urban spaces through design mainly, right? So that's Mike Davis's essay on Fortress LA. So essentially we'll be looking at the connection or the spatial manifestations of class, and that is the focus of these essays. All right. So yeah, chalo, Ambika, start.
Yep. The condition of the working class is 1845. A town such as London, where a man may wander for hours together without reaching the beginning of the end, without meeting the slightest hint which could lead to the interference that there is open country within reach, is a strange thing. This colossal centralization, this heaping together of 2.5 millions of human beings at one point, has multiplied the power of this 2.5 millions 100-fold, has raised London to the commercial capital of the world, created the giant docks, and assembled 1,000 vessels that continually cover the Thames. I know nothing more imposing than the view which the Thames offers during the ascent from the sea to London Bridge. The masses of buildings, the wharves on both sides, especially from Woolwich upwards, the countless ships along both shores, crowding ever closer and closer together until, at last, only a narrow passage remains in the middle of the river, a passage through which hundreds of streamers shoot by one another. All this is so vast, so impressive, that a man cannot collect himself, but is lost in the marvel of England's greatness before he sets foot upon English soil. But the sacrifices which all this has cost become apparent later. After roaming the streets of the capital a day or two, making headway with difficulty through the human turmoil and the endless lines of vehicles, after visiting the slums of the metropolis, one realizes for the first time that these Londoners have been forced to sacrifice the best qualities of their human nature to bring to pass all the marvels of civilization which crowd their city, that 100 powers which slumbered within them have remained inactive, have been suppressed in order that a few might be fully developed more fully, and multiply through union with those of others. The very turmoil of the streets has become repulsive, something against which human nature rebels. The hundreds of thousands of all classes and ranks crowding past each other, are they not all human beings with the same qualities and powers, and with the same interest in being happy? And have they not, in the end, to seek happiness in the same way, by the same means? And still they crowd by one another as though they had nothing in common, nothing to do with one another, and their only agreement is the tacit one, that each keep to his own side of the pavement, so as to not delay the opposing streams of the crowd, while it occurs to no man to honor another with so much as a glance. The brutal indifference, the unfeeling isolation of each in his private interest, becomes the most repellent and offensive. The more these individuals are crowded together within a limited space, and however much one may be aware that this isolation of the individual, this narrow self-seeking, is the fundamental principle of our society everywhere. It is nowhere so shamelessly barefaced, so self-conscious as just here in the crowding of the great city. The dissolution of mankind into monads, of which each one has a separate principle, the world of atoms, is here carried out to its utmost extreme. What is true of London is true of Manchester, Birmingham, Leeds, is true of all great towns. Everywhere bar is indifference, hard egotism on one hand, and nameless misery on the other. Everywhere social warfare, every man's house in the state of siege, reciprocal plundering under the protection of law, and all so shameless, so openly avowed that one shrinks before the consequences of our social state as they manifest themselves here undisguised, and can only wonder where the whole crazy fabric still hangs together. Wonder that the whole crazy fabric still hangs together. Let us investigate some of the slums in their order. London comes first, and in London, the famous rookery of St. Giles, which is now, at last, about to be penetrated by a couple of broad streets. St. Giles is in the midst of the most populous part of the town, surrounded by broad, splendid avenues in which the gay world of London idles about. In the immediate neighborhood of Oxford Street, Regent Street, of Trafalgar Square, and the Strand. It is a disorderly collection of tall, 3 or 4 storied houses with narrow, crooked, filthy streets, in which there is quite as much life as in the great thoroughfares of the town. Except that, here, people of the working class are only to be seen. A vegetable market is held in the street. Baskets with vegetables and fruits, naturally all bad and hardly fit to use, obstruct the sidewalk still further. And from these, as well as from the fish dealer stalls, arises a horrible smell. The houses are occupied from cellar to garret, filthy within and without, and their appearance is such that no human being could possibly wish to live in them. But all this is nothing in comparison with the dwellings in the narrow courts and alleys between the streets, entered by covered passages between the houses, in which the filth and tottering ruin surpass all description. Scarcely a whole window pane can be found. The walls are crumbling, doorposts and windows. Doorposts and window frames loose and broken, doors of old boards nailed together, are altogether wanting in this thieves' quarter, where no doors are needed, there being nothing to steal. Heaps of garbage and ashes lie in all directions, and the foul liquids emptied before the doors gather in stinking pools. Here live the poorest of the poor, the worst paid workers with thieves, and the victims of prostitution indiscriminately huddled together. The majority Irish or of Irish extraction, and those who have not yet sunk in the whirlpool of moral ruin which surrounds them, sinking daily deeper, losing daily more and more of their power to resisting the demoralizing influence of want, filth, and evil surroundings.
Yeah,
Is that
thanks.
it?
Yeah, that's it. That's it. Thanks. So, yeah. So, It's this piece of writing is more descriptive. If you read the whole work by Frederick Engels, you also find at some points where he starts analyzing these conditions which have been created by the industrial city. Now, I don't know if you guys, if you have read the works of Charles Dickens and the kind of descriptions of you know the underclasses in the cities of England have been described very vividly in those novels. And what is important here in this particular essay is, I mean, the description gives you a kind of a picture of what is happening, but what is important for us is to understand the process through which these kinds of conditions of living are created. Now, it's not that for instance, we do have lots of descriptions also of working class Bombay. Chawls, for instance, we talk about quite a lot, which was the predominant form of working class housing in the city for a very long time, and there are still some remnants of this housing type which exist slowly. These are being redeveloped, obviously. Today, the form of working class housing is largely what is called informal settlements or slums, or the rehabilitation units like PSRA and so on, which is essentially the predominant mode of housing. But at some point, the chawls were um, where the working classes lived. Right now, the process that is important for us to understand here is that a large part of this population that lived in these working class quarters that Frederick Engels is describing, these were people who came to the city, right, in search of employment. Um, if you look at the origins of early capitalism in England, a large part of the working class population were actually in the agrarian sector, either landless labor, feudal serfs, small landholders, peasants, and so on. And through various kinds of forced displacements, mainly due to enclosures of these lands. These were lands which were not privately owned, but they were commons, collectively owned lands where anybody could, or there were traditional institutions which governed how these lands were used. When those were displaced through the creation of private property, a large number of the people who dependent on the commons had to flee the countryside to look for employment in the factories of Manchester, London, Birmingham, and so on. Where the mills were. Now, there is a particular change in the social system that arises when feudalism turns into capitalism. Right? When you are a serf in a feudal system, you are tied to land. Um, you the in a sense, you could say that land does not belong to you, but you belong to the land. So it's what happens in capitalism is that the worker is free, in the sense that free to move around and look for employment anywhere, but is also really constrained by the forces of the marketplace. So what happens is, you get employment in these mills, and the wage is extremely meager, right? Extreme and really bare minimum wage. Now, with that wage, you can't afford housing, right, in the city, because the even housing is provided by landlords who have built buildings on these parcels of land and are extracting rent uh, from through accommodation, right? So the only way in which you can afford this housing is by a lot of people sharing the housing. Hmm? And so, in because of the income, the low income, you have more and more people in smaller and smaller parcels of land who crowd together to be able to afford that housing, because that housing cannot be afforded with your wage, right? And automatically you get this kind of highly dense, poorly serviced neighborhoods where the landlord is only concerned about the rent that she or he collects, more predominantly he, and there is very little attention paid to the conditions of living and so on. So you end up in these working class quarters, working class neighborhoods. And the same, I mean, you can say the same story about Bombay, industrial working class housing in Bombay. I mean, for instance, a large part of the what is today called the inner city, and the bubonic plague and so on, those were created by the conditions of living, which were basically landlords trying to exploit every square inch of the land to extract rent from that land, which created more and more overcrowding and so on. So these are the conditions which um, Frederick Engels is describing. Now, it's important to bear in mind that it is not a choice by which people decide to live in these neighborhoods, right? This is a condition, it's a structural condition. It's this compulsion created by your position in the social system. It is not something that people choose to live in such neighborhoods, right? There is very little choice here. And that is essentially what makes it a structural fact of society, which is important to understand. A lot of times we tend to think about housing as a kind of a preference that people have for certain kinds of housing, but it is not that, right? It is what you can afford and what you can manage within that, given your income. So, for instance, if you look at informal settlements in Bombay, the reason why people live in such settlements is because the rents are really low. That is the essential economic fact. Everything else maybe, yeah, you can probably, you can make minor trade-offs, but the larger condition is created by what you can afford in the city, right? It's a very important aspect to understand. And so this is essentially what Engels is describing in working class England, and it's a story that continues. We have, for instance, in Bombay is the city with probably the largest percentage of people living in informal settlements amongst large metropolitan cities, and that has to do with the fact that Bombay is predominantly a city where a lot of people come in search of employment and do not find the affordable options for living in decent conditions, right? And that's the reason why you have this kind of environment that people live in. So what is important to understand is that these, essentially the point that Engels makes in his book, is that these conditions of living are created by the capitalist industrial system. It is not something that is simply an outcome of poor design or lack of attention in terms of how housing should be made, but it is purely an economic outcome of a certain kind of political economy. All right. Okay. So with that, let's move to the next essay, which is contemporary 1990, but which looks at the way in which design is used as a way of excluding, of discriminating, of creating certain kind of markers of class and so on, which is a completely different perspective from Frederick Engels, but it is still a reading of class in the city. Okay. Who wants to read this?
May I read?
Yeah, yeah, go ahead.
This strategic armoring of the city against the poor is especially obvious at street level. In his famous study of the social life of small urban spaces, William White points out that the quality of an urban environment can be measured, first of all, by whether they are convenient, comfortable places for pedestrians to sit. This maxim has been warmly taken to heart by designers of the high corporate precincts of Bunker Hill and its adjacent urban villages. As a part of the city's policy of subsidizing the white collar residential colonization of downtown, tens of millions of dollars of tax revenue have been invested in the creation of attractive, soft environments in favored areas. Planners envision a succession of opulent piazzas, fountains, public art, exotic shrubbery, and comfortable street furniture along a 10-block pedestrian corridor from Bunker Hill to South Park. Brochures sell downtown's livability with idyllic representations of office workers and affluent tourists sipping cappuccino and listening to free jazz concerts in the terraced gardens of California Plaza and Grand Hope Park. In stark contrast, a few blocks away, the city is engaged in a relentless struggle to make the streets as unlivable as possible for the homeless and the poor. The persistence of thousands of street people on the fringes of Bunker Hill and Civic Center tarnishes the image of designer living downtown and betrays the laboriously constructed illusion of an urban renaissance. City Hall has retaliated with its own version of low intensity warfare. An insidious spatial logic An insidious spatial logic also regulates the lives of Los Angeles' working poor. Just across the moat of the Harbor Freeway, west of Bunker Hill, lies the MacArthur Park District, once upon a time the city's wealthiest neighborhood. Although frequently characterized as a no man's land awaiting resurrection by developers, the district is, in fact, home to the largest Central American community in the United States. In the congested streets bordering the park, 100,000 Salvadorans and Guatemalans, including a large community of Mayan speakers, crowd into tenements and boarding houses barely adequate for a fourth as many people. Every morning at 6, this Latino Bantustan dispatches armies of sewing operators, dishwashers, and janitors to turn the wheels of the downtown economy. But because MacArthur Park is midway between downtown and the famous Miracle Mile, it will too, it too will soon fall to redevelopment's bulldozers. Hungry to exploit the lower land prices in the district, a powerful coterie of developers represented by a famous ex-councilman and the former president of the Planning Commission has won official approval for the vision of the Central City West, literally a second downtown comprising 25 million square feet of new office and retail space. Although local politicians have insisted upon a significant quota of low-income replacement housing, such a palliative will hardly compensate for the large-scale population displacement sure to follow the construction of the new skyscrapers in yuppified urban villages. In the meantime, Korean capital seeking Lebensraum for the Los Angeles' burgeoning Koreatown is also pushing into the MacArthur Park area, uprooting tenements to construct heavy fortified condominiums and office complexes. Other Asian and European speculators are counting on the new metro rail station across the park to become a magnet for new investment in the district.
Okay, thanks. So this particular essay is very different from the first one. And the first one is essentially a Dickensian kind of description of the working class neighborhoods of the city, right? This one actually talks about the other side of this story. One important aspect to understand is that the reason why, for instance, if you go back to Frederick Engels' description of working class England, what Engels also explains in his larger work, which is not there in the extract that we gave you, is the relation between wealth and deprivation. Okay, one tends to think that deprivation is basically I mean, every system has its own forms of legitimation and ideology. One of the legitimations is that if you work hard, you can become wealthy and rich, and therefore the corollary of that is that if you're poor, you're because you're not working hard enough or something like that. That's a story that is generally told. So that's why you have programs like Who Wants to Be a Millionaire and all of that, because the idea is that if you if you you know if you want to make it, you have to struggle for it, right? And obviously these stories are also told all the time, in the sense that how do rich folk become rich? Because they, you know if you read business books, for instance, there's always the story of how somebody moved from rags to riches, and it's an important story to tell, because as long as people believe that story, they believe that if you get what you deserve, essentially, right? Now, what Engels in fact describes in the book is the connection between um, uh, wealth, development, and deprivation. mainly because you see, for instance, okay, let's take a concrete case. If you're running a business, and you have workers, now if and you make a certain amount of money, if you pay your workers well, right? If you give them good wages, what happens essentially is that it takes a cut hit on your profits. And therefore, in order to, so for you, the wage of the worker is essentially a cost. Um, and so, as long as you can maintain a system where the costs of production are kept extremely low, you can, create more profits. And therefore, keeping down or suppressing wages, living, which essentially is also linked to cost of services and housing and so on. As long as those things can be kept low, it ensures that the system creates enough growth and profit for the people who the property owners, essentially, right, the capitalist class. And so the poor housing conditions is not simply something that will go away over time given sufficient attention. It is actually the wealth that is created in society is directly producing the poverty that the society also creates, right? So they are they are linked together. It is not like, and therefore when people talk about, okay, how do you create better housing for people? You can't create better housing for people given the system the way it is. You have to alter the way the system works. It is not simply about um, you know better design or better small tinkering of in the way the social arrangements are and so on. Now, what Mike Davis's essay talks about is the other side of the coin, where design is used specifically, okay, as a tool, as a device for creating fortification, for creating exclusions, for ghettoizing or containing certain kinds of developments in the city or certain kinds of populations in the city. So if you read the whole essay, it's a great essay to read, actually, this Fortress LA. In fact, there's a very nice part where he discusses the library that has been designed by Frank Gehry in Los Angeles. It's quite a beautiful description of that library. So, for instance, it's a public library that Frank Gehry has designed, but the library is designed as a fortress. It is designed with very thick walls, which have, which have these glazed tiles on the compound walls, so that graffiti, people can't do make graffiti on it. It has fortified gates. It has cameras which prevent certain kinds of people from entering, or create a certain intimidating environment for so that people don't enter. It has the entire design is muscular and kind of seems to appear as something that does not welcome you. On the other hand, people who access it feel safer, because it keeps certain kinds of people out, right? You see the same thing happening even in our city. For instance, what is generally called beautification is a way of keeping the homeless and vagrants out of pavements. For instance, if you kind of take a ride on one of these lanes in Juhu or Bandra and so on, you have pavements where they put these planters on the pavements. Those planters are not for trees. Nobody likes trees. Those planters are essentially so that the homeless don't come and occupy the pavement, right? So they are essentially anti-poor design interventions. Similarly, there are many public spaces which have these parapet walls, which have concave parapet walls, so that people can't sleep on them and so on. So these are deliberately designed decisions made to keep certain people out, right? Or you have rules and regulations in open spaces which are meant to ensure that only certain kinds of people can access those parks and so on. So these are devices which are used to keep certain kinds of spaces which are not occupied or not inhabited by the poor, to keep the poor out of those areas, or at least to include them with extremely clear terms and conditions. That you can come here, you can work, but don't even think about sleeping or squatting in these neighborhoods, right? So these are ways in which design is used as a way of regulating and controlling and disciplining space. Essentially, that is what this particular essay talks about. So this is also kind of manifestation of class politics in the design of spaces. So if you look at questions of urban planning from a class perspective, you see this happening all the time, right? How do you keep certain people out from certain spaces, or keep people confined to certain particular areas in the city? Another way in which this is done also is through investment. So, for instance, in the city of Bombay, you can see that there are certain parts of the city which are extremely well serviced. When when the government decides to spend, they spend on infrastructure in these neighborhoods. For instance, if you look at, let's say, your freeways, coastal roads, this is public investment that goes into certain neighborhoods of the city, but doesn't go into others. Hmm? It's a way, and when that investment does go into certain other neighborhoods, especially where the poor live, it is usually for capturing a share of that land, or a share of that a part of the city. For instance, the whole Dharavi redevelopment plan can be thought about in that manner. So it's what these essays help you to do is to examine what is called urban development or city planning from a class perspective. That is what Mike Davis's essay also helps in trying to understand. All right. Any questions or comments on what we've discussed so far before we move to the next one? Just 1 second. I'm just reading the comments now. Power cut, family emergency, internet connection. Okay, fine, that's fine. Somebody raised their hands. Shravan, I think. Go ahead, Shravan.
So now, look at like how like spaces in cities evolve due to this economic divide, and that these spaces enforce the economic divide. In terms of the chicken and egg situation, it's clear that the starting point was still that the poorer people came to the city, or should I say, the lower classes. Either way, the point is that the economic divide was already present, but the spatial divide was caused by the economic divide, right?
Mm.
And I'm just clarifying that because
It's not a causal relationship in such a straightforward way. For instance, I came to this. I'm not from Bombay, right? I came to the city as well as a migrant. Hmm? First of all, nobody calls me a migrant. I don't know why. I am a migrant. Most people in Bombay are migrants, actually. But when we say migrants, we mean a particular class of people. Hmm? Now, what's interesting, what's the difference really, if you think about it, is that when I came to the city, I got employment before I came to the city. Actually, I came to the city because I got a job in this institution, right? Um, Whereas largely for poor migrants, the question is the other way around. You come to the city first and then you seek employment. Now, this this has important implications. So what you see is that um, middle and upper class people don't go to cities; they go to organizations. Hmm? Whereas the poor generally go to cities, where where there are a clustering of organizations where employment is generally produced and so on. Now, to answer your question about whether the spatial divide is created by the economic divide, yes, it is true. But what is important is that the spatial divide reproduces the economic divide, isn't it? And is reproduced by the spatial divide. So, for instance, um, if you look at let's say street vendors in the city, street vending is an economic. It's not a choice. It's not a vocation that people choose. That, oh, you know what? When I grow up, I want to be a street vendor. It's it's a job that you that you undertake because you have your options are very few, right? Now, when middle class residents disallow street vending, that economic divide is then reproduced through the spatial divide. You get it? So there's a dual exclusion almost. You are excluded from the formal economy, and then you're also excluded from the city, which reduces the possible. Now, it's not that the city can simply one fine day decide that we want to get rid of all the poor in the city. You can't do that, because the reason why the city produces all of its glorious economic wealth is through the exploitation of the labor of the poor, right? That is where the wealth comes from, right? Who does the work in the city? So it so there is always this kind of so what even Mike Davis's essay is talking about is the way in which this relationship is constantly conflictual and violent. On the one hand, you need the services of the poor. In fact, a lot of our lifestyle is a result of for instance, most of us have a middle income people who have compared to, let's say, um, um, professionals in other developed countries, your wages are very low. But the reason why you enjoy first world lifestyles is because of the cheap services that you get, right? Because you can repress the incomes of the poor even further. Okay, so that's an important thing to understand. Our for instance, with my income, I can not afford housing in Bombay, but I can afford very cheap services, right? So this relationship between the economic benefits of a middle class lifestyle is dependent directly on the labors of the poor. But on the other hand, if you im, im, if there is an investment in the conditions of the poor, these benefits that the middle class gets will be reduced. Services will become more expensive, for instance. For you to be able to continue your your standard of living, you have to you find ways to depress the standard of living of the poorer sections of the city, right? You understand so it is not that you can simply address the problem of we read another essay last year, remember, Herbert Gans, Uses of Poverty. The idea is that your privilege is a result of urban poverty. It is not urban poverty is not a problem outside of our lifestyles. It is very much a construct of our lifestyle. You understand? So that's essentially, and so now you have a lot of people who live in the city who are providing essential services, but you also want to make sure that they don't inhabit your neighborhoods, that they don't come and use your open spaces, that they don't come and use your parks. So you create all of these design devices like fences and security guards and surveillance systems and so on to keep them out, right? So that is the way in which these conflicts in the political economy get manifested in space. Yeah, I hope that addresses some of the question that you were asking, Shravan.
Yeah, and much more. Thank you.
Okay, so let's move to the third one. This one is a little more conceptual, this essay, but it's an interesting reading of. Uh, in fact, the title of this set of readings, City, Class, and Power, comes from this particular reading. It's a good book by Castells called City, Class, and Power, and it will what I just said. It kind of speaks about the same things more theoretically. So let's read this one, and then we'll have a general discussion. So who wants to read this?
I don't mind reading.
Go ahead. Go ahead.
Okay. So, where does urban politicization come from, and where is it leading to? At one level, it is a result of a contradictory process engendered by the economic and social evolution of advanced capitalism. The concentration of production and the units of management, as well as the concentration of the necessary labor force. The spatial concentration of workers determines the concentration of the means of consumption which they need. This relates as much to the private individual consumption, goods sold on the market, as to collective consumption, indivisible goods and services. Moreover, the increasing interdependence of the various units of production and management compels the smooth functioning of the whole economic complex in production as well as consumption. These processes are at the basis of the urban structure of large cities. The strategic role of the labor force in the process of production correspondingly increases the role of the means of collective consumption necessary to it, especially public resources and facilities. Housing, schools, creches, nurseries, health services, cultural activities, transport, and so on, all have become essential to the urban structure and to the requirements of the production process. Could one possibly imagine a labor market without a transport system capable of distributing mostly at the same time each day workers all over the city? Thus, if it is true that our society remains first and foremost determined by the process of production, collective consumption, while remaining a secondary contradiction, it is acquiring an increasingly important role in social organization. As the working class movement acquired strength and political influence in advanced capitalist countries, the direct wage received from employers has increasingly been supplemented by an indirect wage socially levied and by collective goods and services, which often become more important for the popular living standard than the nominal amount of direct wages. This leads us to a major contradiction of capitalist development. The logic of a capital, the logic of capital cannot fulfill a diversity of fundamental demands. It is in an attempt to resolve this contradiction that the state decisively intervenes in the production, distribution, and management of the means of collective consumption and the spatial organization of these services. However, this intervention is not a simple regulating mechanism. The action of the state is a result of political process which is largely determined by class struggle. Political conflicts will therefore be determined in the management of the means of collective consumption and the urban system. Urban struggles, municipal political alternatives, the debate around collective consumption, and the city planning play a crucial role in the present political dynamic. It is all the more paradoxical in that it is the dominant classes which initially pose the urban question at the forefront of the political scene in an attempt to substitute the contradiction between labor capital with the problems of quality of life. This implicit attempt to neutralize social contradictions, thus defined a solution as a technical problem, has stumbled upon a major oversight. The quality of life is not a context but a practice. And if it is practice which leads to the discovery that there were indeed new social contradictions in the organization of cities, these moreover are closely articulated to the ensemble of class relations, to the relations of power. This is why the relation between city and power appears to us to be at the center of the current urban problematic, for it is power which structures the city. The movements which it gives birth play a strategic role in the transformation of power. Yeah.
Okay, thanks, Fleur. So this one, as I said, this was a little more theoretical, but the essential ideas are very simple. Hmm? What it is trying to say is that look, if you have if you have a capitalist economy, you're going to have certain kind of extremely deep-rooted contradictions. For instance, if you want a modern production system, hmm? Let's say you're manufacturing cars or something like that, the product that you make requires land or requires infrastructure for you to be able to use it, right? So most cars actually are driven on public streets. So if you are a car manufacturer, you can't really make a profit by selling a car which people are going to keep in their homes, right? You have to use space which is actually belongs to nobody or everybody, yeah. And that's an important contradiction, because you can't privatize streets. You can't have car owners also buying their piece of land to drive their cars on. Hmm? Similarly, there are other kinds of contradictions in the capitalist system. For instance, land is held as private property in the capitalist system, but as long as property by its very nature or by its definition means that certain people are excluded from it, right? So if you have all land held as private property, you can't really have a city which works, because in order to do anything, in order to carry out any public works, you need to have land which is not owned privately, right? So these contradictions are constantly a part of the capitalist economy. Now, for instance, what Castells talks about is an important concept that he brings out, which is the question of collective consumption goods. Now, when we were reading Frederick Engels and the conditions of the working classes, obviously, if you create conditions where a large part of society is going to be living in conditions which are completely unacceptable from a human point of view, something has to give at some point, right? Either this mass of people will simply overthrow the system, or certain concessions will have to be made by the capitalist class. Now, how does that happen in the city? Okay, so the way it happens in the city is that either employers can increase wages, hmm, which would help workers then afford housing which is provided by the market economy, but that usually doesn't happen. What happens instead is the creation of what is called collective consumption goods, or state provision of certain kinds of conveniences like public transport or public housing and so on. What that does is, to take a concrete case, let's look at the example of the Mumbai's suburban railway system. Okay, now if everybody had only private modes of transport, how would all of these millions of workers come to their workplaces every day? And if they would come, they would need, you would have to spend a lot of money to be able to travel, right? It's just not affordable for people to have private vehicles to move around the city in this manner. So either employers would have to increase wages, or the state steps in and provides public transport systems. What the public transport system does is it provides cheap, affordable transport to workers at a social cost. The cost is borne by the city as a whole, right? That is why you have subsidized transport systems like the train system, railway system, or the bus system, and so on. This is what is called collective consumption goods. So what he's talking about, Castells, is that the wage of the workers is substituted by a social wage or supplemented by a social wage. And if you look at all of the what is called the welfare state policies, healthcare, education, public transport, public housing, these are all social wages, essentially, right? Because you don't need to buy these through your own income. What you're doing is you're getting them as as a right, essentially, sometimes as a right or sometimes as a part of government policy. So your social wage is supplementing your income. So even if you have lower incomes, you are able to fulfill your essential material needs like transport or housing and so on, because the state is providing those services. So there is a constant tension even here, because it's not that once the public transport is created, it is always going to be around, right? For instance, right now you see that in the bus system there is a privatization of the BEST system, which means that ticket prices are going up, which means that it is becoming difficult for people to afford these privatized systems and so on. So there is a constant struggle over collective consumption goods. Public housing is almost entirely stocked in the city. Right now, you have rehabilitation, which is different, which is not public housing. Right. So there is a constant struggle over collective consumption goods. And what happens is, generally, when you have social movements in the city, these social movements, which is essentially by the mass of laboring people in the city, these movements are for collective consumption goods. So you can have social movements which are aimed at employers for better wages and so on, which is essentially what happens in the factory. You know, better conditions, better wages, and so on, or less time. Or you have urban struggles which are over collective consumption goods, public transportation, public housing, better amenities, and so on, right? So what Castells is doing is he is starting with the question of capitalism and class, and he's trying to understand how social movements come about and what are the demands of social movements in the city. And you have labor struggles in the workplace, but you have social movements in the city which are demanding collective consumption goods, right? That is why you see the moment there is a question of privatization of public transport, there is a struggle. Or the moment there is a question of taking over public land for some mega project or something like that, there is a struggle. So these are struggles over collective consumption goods, which are essentially working class struggles in the city. For because when these are overturned, what who the people it hurts most are the working classes, right? And so he is trying to understand social movements through the question of capitalist class, right? That's essentially the main argument of this particular book, City, Class, and Power. And he's obviously saying that when the question of power here is that when you have an organized social movement, that 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 is where there is a power dynamic. And when the organized power of working people is reduced, that is when you start having the privatization of many of these public systems which were won earlier through earlier social movements, right? So it's not that once they are created they are going to remain there. They are constantly subject to power relations and power dynamics, and therefore, in order for us to understand why certain things, certain trends go in a certain direction, we can look at these questions through the perspective of class politics, and we get insights which help us understand these dynamics. Okay, so that's essentially where Castells is coming from. Yeah. Okay. Questions, comments? If you didn't understand, please let me know so I can explain again. Yeah, Aradhya, go ahead.
So can this problematic situation that happens in the city be overcome if the amount of development or capitalization that takes place in an area is predetermined by the state?
The question is, look, for instance, we have a system called, we have a um, system of organizing investments in the city, which is called planning. All right. Now, essentially, planning is supposed to do that. So, for instance, a large part of planning is about investing in areas where there is low development, so that the level of infrastructure and services and all can be improved, right? But if you look at the way in which planning actually takes place, investment is usually directed in areas which are already well serviced, right? And the areas which are less serviced are either taken away for other uses or are continue to remain neglected, right? So even in state planning processes, you see a certain kind of class politics. So it's not that the state is a completely neutral agency. The state is also subject to class politics, and in some at some points in the city's history you see it more. In some other points you see it less, but it's always there, right? So that's important to understand. That this the state is not going to. One thinks that the state is a neutral agency, but it is not. It is always subject to this question of power that Castells is talking about. When you have organized movements, that time the state tends to move in the direction of collective consumption goods. When those movements become weaker, the state tends to move towards the interests of the capitalist class, right? So it's always, the state is always subject to power politics. It's not a neutral agency. Hmm?
In
So
fact,
for
a lot
small
of the
cities, oh,
yeah, I was just saying that in fact, a lot of the struggles against the development plan, Mumbai's recent development plan, which got recently sanctioned, was about this kind of class politics, and were struggles over collective consumption goods, which were being privatized or kind of, transformed through changes in land use, etc. So the way the state plans today is not necessarily to ensure services and amenities for all, but it's actually trying to if there one needs to understand the politics of planning or how
Shweta, we lost you.
plans the state comes up with. That needs to be re-examined.
Shweta, just repeat what you just said because we lost you in the middle.
No, I don't know which part. I basically said that the politics over Mumbai's development plan was a kind of a struggle over, class struggle over collective consumption goods. And
Hmm.
the state often does not necessarily ensure equitable access to, as planning is supposed to do that, it's supposed to ensure equitable access to services, amenities, and goods. But the state does not necessarily act in the interest of the working class or the poor, and one needs to understand the politics of planning or how state planning is influenced by certain actors or interest groups, which results in this kind of class disparity and it's
Yeah.
exacerbating those conditions. So I think one needs to understand these urban social movements in Bombay over even the conflict over Mumbai's development plans were in fact class struggles about the right to the city or access to some of these collective consumption goods.
Yeah. Shravan, you have your hand up.
yeah, thank you.
Yeah, it's more of a comment, but it's interesting how, like, ever since the era of Jack the Ripper, which was mainly a tale that was haunting low-income neighborhoods, a lot of London's horror stories have had a very urban setting. But if you look right across the Atlantic in the US, it's all like very countryside and rural. But London specifically still has a very urban setting for its horror stories. And I think India, it's a bit more widespread of a net, but it's just funny that these two countries have such a weird dynamic between how their horror works, where one is more focused on quiet location, while London has committed serious crimes in its urban population, and horror stories know that in some way.
Hmm. I am not sure what the connection of that to
No,
what
this
we're
is society.
discussing.
The societal view of London's cities. It's very different from what America views its city as. Like America still has the American dream, where cities are these strongholds of growth and development. But London still holds this kind of subconscious resentment towards its cities in some way.
Hmm. Hmm.
I disagree with that. In fact, a lot of the poorer neighborhoods in London and a lot of the working class neighborhoods are also undergoing a lot of urban renewal, and I think something that was discussed in the second essay of how certain neighborhoods in London or in cities get gentrified and certain users get displaced because of the rise in rent, etc. So one sees the same kind of forces in different cities. I mean, you can compare New York to London and Bombay, and you'll find many similarities in actually what's going on.
Mm.
Yeah.
But I think, Shraddha, I think what Shravan is also trying to say is to talk about popular culture and the idea of what is hostile. And I think what he is referring to is um, the the um, the source of fear in British popular culture is more urban, whereas in America it is rural. That's what you're saying, Shravan, isn't it?
Yeah, like London had that kind of phrase where the British dream was like, the British dream is still like a bygone era, but in America, compared to America at least, like it's still like the current situation is still leaning towards protecting the American dream at all costs. While in
Yeah.
London, there is some resentment towards that kind of ideal.
Okay. Okay. I mean, I take it as a comment. I don't know what to say. So.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
I
Okay.
also
Anybody
don't
else?
necessarily agree with. I mean, I don't know if I'm not too sure if that's accurate.
Yeah, no, because you see the thing also now is Shravan, that America was has always been an agrarian utopian kind of society. If you think about the Jeffersonian view of an ideal society, which is an agrarian peasant economy, whereas uh, the capitalism in mainland Europe or in England was an urban phenomenon. Perhaps that may have something to do with it. But look, I am not sure. I don't
But
know.
we
I don't
still,
understand
but
what the
you
connection is
still
there.
see that romanticization of the countryside and suburbanization and those things even in London. So it's
Yeah,
not
yeah.
like,
That's
there's no in fact the British English countryside is something that is kind of, seen as
mm,
the escape for the
yeah,
the elite and also the,
yeah,
rich
yeah,
urban dwellers. So I think one cannot generalize like that
yeah. I
when you
agree.
compare.
Mm. Okay. Any other question or comment? All right then. So let's stop. And next week, what are we doing? One second. I'll just tell you very quickly. So next week we are doing rebel cities, which will take forward the theme of urban social movements, and we look at the nature of urban social movements in the recent past mainly. I think all the essays are more contemporary. So yeah. Okay. So like this time we'll upload the essay maybe a day or on the same day, and we'll continue. All right. Okay. Have a good week. Take care, guys. Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.